Welcome to another episode of the Modern CFO in Real Time, a series produced by Red Owl. My name is Sumal Karunanayake. I am the Chief Commercial Officer here at Red Owl. The aim of this series is to curate conversations with senior finance and industry leaders who are shaping the future of business, finance, technology, and leadership, sharing insights and valuable perspectives from their unique vantage points. Now, today I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Anouska Ladds, who is the Executive Vice President of Commercial and New Payment Flows for Mastercard across Asia Pacific and Japan. Anouska leads Mastercard's commercial payments and innovation strategy across one of the most dynamic and rapidly evolving regions in the world, helping businesses modernize payments, improve access to finance, and embrace new innovations in security, digital commerce, and embedded financial experiences. Over the course of Anouska's career, Anouska has built deep expertise across payments, banking, commercial finance, and technology transformation across Europe, the Americas, and Asia Pacific, becoming one of the leading voices in the future of commercial payments and financial inclusion across the region. Anouska, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining us today.
You make me sound really good. Thank you so much for that very warm introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you, Kamal. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Awesome. Hey, look, so let's just start a little bit about yourself, your background, and in particular, your early career journey. So part of this podcast and the intent is to influence young people that are on a career trajectory as well. So it'll be kind of good to get your perspective on your journey.
So as you can probably tell by my accent, I am British. And I actually started my career in telecommunications, actually. And then I decided I wanted to move into finance because everybody wants and needs money. So I thought, it's actually quite a good function to go into. So I joined Barclays and I was there for around 5 years. And I did a whole range of roles, starting more as a data analyst, and then I moved into looking at entry into new markets, which was really exciting. And then Sumal, I had some really great advice actually from a very senior female leader at Barclays. And this is when I was kind of mid to late 20s. And she said, Anouska, you really need to go and work internationally, because if you want to experience the true financial industry, you can't just have a vantage point from the UK. You've got to go and explore what it's like in different markets. And to be honest with you, Sumal, I thought to myself, where speaks English? And actually, where could I get a visa? And it was the US or Australia. And I managed they let me into Australia, which was amazing. And this is where I joined Mastercard, and it was the best decision that I think I made. I've been at Mastercard for 18 years, and
Wow.
Which I can't quite believe. And I joined there looking at what we call customer marketing. And I suppose the way to look at it was really trying to help clients, so banks and customers, to accelerate their portfolios. And that's where I did a whole range of roles, including product. I was in our services function. I went into market development, and then I moved to be the chief of staff for our international president. And that was an amazing role because you see behind the curtain in a company and you really get to understand how the engine room of the organization. Then I led strategy for international markets, and then I decided I needed another move, and that took me here to Singapore, where I'm based, where I lead commercial payments. And I think your question around what are some of the guidance and points that I would have for more junior folks that are thinking about their own careers, I think there's probably three, I don't want to call it advice, but things that I've learned along the way. One is take the risk. If you look at my career journey, it wasn't really fluidly logically mapped out. The moves that I did geographically, or when I went into a global role, I went into an internal role, or a merchant-facing role. It was all with the intent to say, how do I broaden my skills and experience? So I think take a risk. The other is don't always think upwards. A lot of the roles that I did, I think I made 5 lateral moves before I then got promoted. And that was trying to learn as much as I could about the company and about the industry, because I thought as I went if I was successful enough to move up the funnel, I'd have all of that experience. And the third is build your network. So actually, it is really important to have your network and connectivity. There's people I work with now that I worked with at day one that I joined the company. And so building that network is essential. And, I think be clear around what you want and what you don't want, because don't sit and wait for somebody to tap you on the shoulder to get there. So you do need to have a little bit of patience, which isn't my strength.
Brilliant. And look, and thank you for that. And what wonderful advice. And just kind of double clicking on leadership. There is a popular belief that leadership isn't necessarily about managing people, and leadership is everybody's responsibility, if you like. What's your perspective on somebody that's coming through the ranks? What advice or what counsel can you give somebody that's on a trajectory in their career around embracing leadership? And so what does leadership mean to you?
It's quite interesting, because whenever I talk about leadership to people, they automatically think people. Okay, I've got to have leadership, I've got to have people. I actually think there's probably 2 or 3 components to leadership. One is around how do you drive followership? And that actually means you don't have to have people directly reporting to you. In fact, that is probably the easier leadership, if you want to call it, because, having those folks that are directly reporting to you, they're looking to you for guidance, direction and so forth. Leadership actually needs to come in a multiple of ways. One is, yes, the individuals, if you do have them reporting to you. But fundamentally, leadership is, how are you leading your function or your role across the organization? And that comes with being able to influence others. That becomes with having very clear storytelling around what you're looking to do. And that comes with actually being empathetic and understanding other people's point of view. Leadership isn't, okay, this is where we're going, get out of my way. It's actually understanding, okay, how do we navigate through this or through the organization? And who do I need to be bringing with me along the way? And I think I learned that as my career went on. I thought leadership was very, very squarely in to demonstrate leadership, I need to have people reporting to me. And actually, as I've progressed, that is definitely not the case. Leadership is, how you're leading your role, your function through the organization.
Yeah, and that is so true. From your perspective, what are some of the key traits, if you were to sort of, if there was a room full of graduates here that were saying, I want to go, embrace a career in payments and in the whole financial services industry, what are 1 or 2 things that you would be able to kind of give them to be able to embrace and execute as well?
My number 1 trait that I look for when I hire anyone, and particularly when you're looking at a job description, some people might look at it and say, oh, I don't have this skill, so maybe I won't apply for a role or I won't go for a role. The number 1 trait I always look for is attitude. And actually, because I can train and educate and support on a subject matter, but if you don't have the right attitude, and what does that attitude mean? It is that positive mindset, that I call it scrappy mindset, always wanting to think, how can I do more? What are the things that I can do? Prioritization with that as well, making sure you're not saying yes to everything, and then being a really good team member, right? And supporting others, very much thinking about the we and not the I.
Yeah, and look, we can't have a podcast without mentioning AI. But
Yes.
in this day and age, especially with AI, regardless of function, broadly in white collar jobs, let's just say, we'll go from take people from 0 to say 60 in terms of doing all of those deterministic tasks and what have you.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I actually see AI as an enabling kind of component to roles. And if I actually think about how I'm using it, I'm using it to help me make decisions faster, but I'm not using it to make the decision, right? And
Yes.
I'm leveraging a whole range of inputs to be able to do that. But I think as AI becomes more commonplace as it is, the people skills and the collaboration, as you were mentioning, Sumal, will actually become even more important. If you look at sales, and people always want to buy from people, right? And people want to interact with others. And I think those collaboration and people skills will become even more important. AI will help us to get to decisions faster, or, some of those other tasks that might have taken, longer to do. But actually, in terms of that engagement and collaboration, that is going to become even more heightened. So I think, as I was talking about having the right attitude and coming with the right mindset, that's going to be even more important, I feel, as we move forward.
Yeah, look, spot on. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the broader transformation that is happening across payments globally. What are the biggest shifts that you are currently seeing and trends, I guess, that are reshaping the payments ecosystem across APJ as an example?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably, two or three components, and let's touch on these. I think, first of all, if we look at SMEs, right? And SMEs are the lifeblood of all economies, right? And when you think about the importance of SMEs, if I just take a step back to AP and then bring it down to Australia, 97% of enterprises across Asia are SMEs, right? And you think about this, they are employing the majority of the workforce, around 70% of the workforce. They are a significant driver of GDP. And I think in Australia, it's the same. It's around 97% of businesses are small businesses. And so when you think about unlocking the ability for SMEs in terms of economics, in terms of access to working capital, and in terms of really simplifying processes and procedures to let them focus on doing what they do best, which is running their business, there are still, if you look at the tools that are developed today for SMEs, they actually didn't have them in mind. So whether this is managing payments, cash flow, expenses, and so forth, a lot of this was actually designed for either consumer or the large corporates, right? And when you look at SMEs today, I think around 80% of Australian SMEs are actually still relying on manual or paper-based expense workflows. So think about what that leads to: delays, errors, blind spots in cash flow. And also, when you think about how they're completing this, invariably this is 10 o'clock at night, right? Because they are running their business during the day, and then they're sitting there at 10 o'clock trying to reconcile all of the payments, because they didn't get into their business to be a CFO, right? Or a CMO or a CISO. Ultimately, they were there to run their business. And so actually giving them faster, more visible payments capability to really improve their cash flow forecasting and reduce that exposure to fraud is critical. And what does that do? It frees them up to be able to manage their business. And actually, we know a large majority of SMEs run into problems because of poor cash flow management, right? And access to working capital. So unlocking that for SMEs, I think, is absolutely critical. And we can talk a little bit more about what we're doing what we're doing with SMEs at this point. So I think, the shifts and trends there's a big focus to supporting SMEs, because actually they are the economy, right? They are driving the GDP. And if we can unlock some of the areas that have previously been locked or made difficult for them, I definitely think that is a big area of focus. And then the other is around AI. So when we start to look at the impact of AI, we're really seeing SMEs are trying to get ahead of the curve, but they are really under supported in this. And we ran a survey recently. There's about 2,500 small businesses across Asia. And when we ask them some very specific questions on how they're engaging with AI tools, almost 40% of Australian SMEs are already spending and leveraging AI tools, right? And whether this is generative AI, productivity platforms, and we see a high percentage of that planning to increase spending. And so when we look at agentic and when we look at AI, we really do feel that the building blocks are starting to be put in place to really help generate and gain that efficiency for SMEs. And then when we look at the large end of town, when we're looking at corporates, actually, when you look at the payment systems and capabilities that are put in place for corporates, there's still a lot of friction that is sitting in the ecosystem. A lot of this is either manual, paper-based, or archaic systems that weren't really built to have whether this is embedded finance, whether this is to move friction out of the ecosystem. So I genuinely believe we're sitting at the beginning of a bit of a revolution in B2B payments, whether this is, leveraging tools, capabilities, AI to help SME, all the way through to looking at embedded finance into ERPs, into expense management platforms, at really simplifying payments and reconciliation within the larger end of town.
Yeah, that's awesome. And look, clearly you've talked about this before, and you're quite passionate about it. One of the things, and that whole concept of, what was the statistic? 97% of the backbone of the AP economy, Asia Pac economy, is SMEs. From a Mastercard perspective, there's got to be a balance, I guess, in terms of Mastercard's known for its innovation and leaning in terms of experimentation and innovation, but doing so always with that zero trust and resilience in place within its rails. How are you balancing that?
Our brand is fundamentally built on trust. If you think about the legacy of where we've come, and actually we've been using AI for years, and actually where we've used a lot of this capability is exactly on this kind of fraud, and really making sure that from a security perspective, we're spotting those trends. We're leveraging AI as a way to really be able to integrate to help drive that trust and look at predictions around security and fraud. Now, and innovation, as you will probably know, is fundamentally in our DNA. But for me, trust is absolutely a non-negotiable, right? We are building every solution really on a foundation of privacy, transparency, and responsible data stewardship. And we absolutely like to move fast in innovation, and we have to with everything that is going on in the world today, but never at the expense of safety. And innovation for me, it isn't about let's push the boundaries just for the sake of it. It's about really giving businesses and consumers actually control and clarity and confidence. Ultimately, this is really, really critical when you think about, particularly for SMEs in the business world. One data breach, one fraud intervention can actually be, it can be devastating for their business. And so ultimately, what is absolutely critical for them is to know that the data is protected, the choices are respected. And so therefore, security has to sit at the heart of everything that we do. Cyber criminals are operating across coordinated networks. They're becoming very sophisticated. And so we've built a lot of platforms like SafetyNet and Consumer Fraud Risk. These, and to bring to life what that does, it scans billions of transactions globally, and it acts as like the first and the second line of defense. And SafetyNet alone has declined over 70 billion fraudulent transactions today. Just
Wow.
70 billion. I mean, it's crazy, right?
Yes.
And now I talked a little bit about AI, and this is where AI can actually really help, really embedding this into the customer journey, whether that's from account opening, transactions, monitoring, connecting data, and the dots across identity signals. And so for us, this is absolutely one of the most critical things that we invest in Mastercard. We work with the regulators, industry consortiums, cross-sector coalitions and so forth to really stay ahead of the trends. And I think agentic is really an example of how we're balancing this trust with innovation. We're using AI agents as they're starting to act on behalf of businesses. One of the critical things that businesses will start to think about is, okay, well, if I'm using an AI agent to set decisions and run, and they almost become, they're making payments on behalf of me, trust actually becomes really foundational to that. So we're embedding security, privacy, accountability into agentic innovation, and through initiatives such as verifiable intent. And I think this is really important that as innovation moves forward, trust, security has to sit at the foundation of everything that we do in payments. Because like I said, one fraudulent attack can actually, be devastating for a business. So it fundamentally sits at the foundation of everything that we do and is critical as we move forward as well.
That's awesome. Just
Yeah.
switching gears a little bit in terms, and you kind of touched on this in terms of agentic and AI. One of the most fast emerging concepts is agentic payments, and you touched on this as well, where the agents are autonomously initiating transactions and purchase decisions. And as you know, we are driving this concept of real-time governance and tokenized approval prior to a transaction ever being executed, all built on trust and all of the rails that Mastercard has. From your perspective, approaching concepts like that, to be able to then not only apply it at a large SME B2C type context, but then through the corporate echelons as well. What's your perspective in terms of that? Because a lot of the payments that happen at the enterprise level are still B2B wire transfers, etc. So where do you see this impacting and turning the dial from an impact perspective at that enterprise level?
Yeah, this is something I'm really excited about, actually, because I think this is where we can really see, and we're already beginning to see some real meaningful progress, but there's a lot more to do, and I'm very, very excited about it. We're seeing plenty of pilots and contained experiments at the moment. We recently announced a series of programs actually across Australia and New Zealand, where we conducted 9 real live, fully tokenized, authenticated transactions within agentic. And I'll come on to talk a little bit more about what they were, but a couple of those were sitting very much in the large corporate space. And I really see the focus, particularly at the large end of town, around the opportunity on 3 areas. One, I think agents handling invoice reconciliation. And so if you think about, collections of invoice reconciliation, knowing where the money's come from, knowing whether that invoice has been paid, there's still a lot of manual intervention. There's whole teams that are sitting to drive that. And actually that comes with inefficiencies, that can come with, human error. And so actually invoice reconciliation can really help speed up business operations and really drive those efficiencies. Cash flow anomalies as well before they become crises, because even at the large end of town, cash flow still is absolutely critical. And that is making sure that you're spotting when you need to make payments. It is looking at where is there ability to negotiate early payment discounts, but leveraging capabilities such as virtual card numbers to be able to help give that access to working capital. And I'm really kind of using it as a CFO assistant, let's call it, to helping make those decisions and looking at any issues in the system before they become real crises, I think is another area. And then the third is auto applying rewards to the highest yielding categories. So benefits optimization. And so for me, it isn't a single task because, I talked about when we look at the ecosystem, particularly in the large end of town, there is still a lot of legacy systems that are being used today, right? And I think the critical thing here is how do we start to connect the dots across the value chain? And it isn't one single task, and it isn't one single individual or provider or business that can do that. Because if you think about it, in a typical B2B transaction, you've got a supplier invoice coming through in one system. That's going to approve one logic. You've got then FX being applied. You've then got this going into an enterprise platform. You then may have to come out to make a payment somewhere else. And then you've got another system that then needs to look to reconcile the payments. And this all requires the coordination with the human or an analyst or a treasury manager that's got to act as that orchestration layer, chasing every steps and making sure. And then you think about the handoffs that have to occur there. So we're seeing AI and agents can start to take control of that sequencing. They know where the transaction is. They know what decision needs to be made, and they can act within the human oversight and intervention and guardrails. And that becomes really critical, setting those controls and rules. And we talked a little bit about security earlier, being able to set those guardrails to ensure that actually there's that right level of security. But that is where the practical value is really emerging. So for me, it's less about one individual single AI task. It's about connecting this fragmented workflow to really help businesses run much more effectively and reliably. And that actually requires the industry to come together, right? Because technology is moving so fast, but what is actually lagging to some degree is institutional readiness, whether this is integration, whether this is governance, and the ability to really embed agents into live processes. So this is very exciting, I think, in terms of where AI and agentic is going, because I think it will have the capability in small and large organizations to really remove that friction and help speed up processes and procedures.
No, look, spot on, and you're right about the the regulatory underpinnings or the frameworks needing to catch up. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up with a crystal ball moment.
Oh God.
If I
Okay,
may,
let me get it out and let me have a think.
Yes. And so when you look ahead and let's say over the next 5 to 10 years, what do you think the future of payments and commercial finance will look like? Now, and let's presume for a second that, the regulatory equilibrium will catch up with us at some point. But, what is your sort of blue sky vision in terms of what is the future holding us in this area?
So I actually think, look how far we've come in the last 10 years. But I think if you just look at how far and quickly technology is emerging, it's super exciting. And so I think in the next 10 years, where we are, and this is more thematic, I think is moving from, when we're already seeing this shift of managing transactions to orchestrating outcomes, right? And so I think the payments life cycle is going to become, and already is becoming, much more automated, from invoices to reconciliation, for example. So we're seeing the CFOs aren't spending time, or we won't see CFOs spending time on manual processes, but they're going to really sit at the intersection of the data, the payments, the operation, and risk, and having those real-time signals to guide businesses' decisions. That is super exciting. So rather than looking behind at what's already happened, you can start to look ahead and say, what do we think will happen? And how do we get ahead of that based on leveraging trends, insights, AI and data and so forth to help them do that? And I think governance doesn't necessarily get easier, because obviously governance continues to be super important, but it's now going to get smarter and more embedded, right? And I think embedded is the absolute critical word in terms of removing friction as we think about where AI and agentic is going to help. And so, in the past, our governance and our oversight has looked behind us. And
Yes.
So I think what is emerging now is from into pre-transactional governance. So this is where you're going to have the controls, the governance, the intent are built directly into the workflows. And so what's super exciting about that is that decisions can be made before money moves, not after, right? And where we have, as I spoke about, very complex B2B environments where a single transaction can span multiple systems, that's what's going to be super important. But as we head towards tomorrow, how that's going to help businesses run much more effectively.
Wow, thank you. And that was an incredible summary. I think you encapsulated everything. Thank you, Anouska. There were so many valuable insights in that conversation, from leadership, career development, through to the future of AI-driven payments, financial inclusion, and the evolving role of trust and security, which you categorically, is the underpinning of everything we do, right? To build trust and confidence. Again, thank you very much to you for being so generous with your time and your insights. Thank you to everybody for listening in on another episode of the Modern CFO in Real Time, produced by Red Owl. We look forward to bringing you more conversations with senior leaders such as Anouska in the not too distant future. So thanks again. Ciao for now.
Thanks, Sumal.
Cheers, Anouska. Bye.